Hi, friends. We are entering a season in which countless people all over the earth is celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ. And if you're a believer, the scripture in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son," that would be familiar to you. What I want to do today is look at that concept of Jesus being the only begotten or the beloved Son of God and follow the history of its development. Where did that idea come from? And the purpose for doing this is to open up new possibilities of meaning. Because we're so used to just accepting statements as fact and not delving into the real depth of its meaning. And to understand a statement such as that simply as a dogmatic belief, instead of seeing where the metaphor came from, how the story developed, can rob us of such beautiful insights. For the first few hundred years after Christ, what occupied the theologians, the believers, was this question: who is Jesus? How do we articulate the fact that we encountered something both divine and human in this one person? And all the initial creeds, the Nicene Creed that was 325 years after Christ, the Constantinople, the one in Ephesus, the Chalcedon Creed, all of them tried to find the language to describe this encounter of divine wisdom embodied in a human person. And I think they kind of complicated the question because of the philosophical ideas that they tried to reconcile it with. For the first believers, I don't think the problem was as acute as it became later, but we'll get to that. Let's start with the context of the first believers and where that idea came from, because I have no doubt that the disciples and those who encountered Jesus knew that he was human, and at the same time that they were aware that his life and his message unveiled something divine, and how to speak about a fellow human who also somehow embodies the peace, the desire of God is an intriguing and complex question. And how we answer it will either make it very relevant to our lives or just make it another dogma about somebody else. I hope to show you through this transformation of meaning how it can become so relevant to your life. So to find a beginning to this story, we'll have to begin with the idea of the beloved Son. And how did this idea of a beloved Son develop? Now, in Scripture, in the context of the Hebrew Bible, the idea of the only begotten Son begins in the context of sacrifice. In Exodus 22, you can read it from verse 28 onwards, God says, "The firstborn of all your stock, etc., belongs to me, including the firstborn of your sons." So this wasn't just a spiritual commandment of dedicate your firstborn son to the Lord, this was in the context of physical sacrifice. Yes, there was provisions made in how you could redeem your firstborn son. Instead of your son, you could redeem him with an animal. So there was a substitution possible. But many scholars would agree that actual child sacrifice did happen in ancient Jewish culture and religion. The fact that both Jeremiah and Ezekiel condemns the practice of child sacrifice is because it happened. So the context of where did the idea of the firstborn son comes from, the context is sacrifice. Now, within an agricultural community, obviously the firstborn son is of great value. He might mean the difference between surviving and not, and to give up your firstborn son is to give up what is of greatest value. So the idea of the only begotten or the firstborn son begins within a human context. Humans imagined that they gave God their most precious gift in sacrificing their firstborn son. Over time, obviously, the sacrifice of the firstborn is transformed into animal sacrifice. However, the concept remains. So some of the most famous examples would obviously be Abraham and Isaac, where God asks him to sacrifice Isaac. And he, in a sense, undergoes this symbolic death and resurrection through the substitute that is provided. Now, the firstborn then also takes on the meaning of not only is he very valuable, but he's beloved, chosen, and favored. So maybe a good example of that from scripture would be Jacob and Esau. So Esau is born first and then Jacob. But as the story unfolds, Jacob becomes the highly favored one. He gets the blessing instead of Esau. But it's not as simple as just saying that instead of favoring the firstborn, I'm going to favor the secondborn. No, there has to be an actual transformation in which Jacob buys the right of the firstborn, and he gets the blessing. In effect, he becomes the firstborn, as his father also gives him the blessing under deception. He gives him the blessing of the firstborn. And so the idea that the firstborn is also highly favored, is chosen, starts entering this whole development of the narrative of what do we mean by the firstborn son. He's very valuable, highly favored, chosen. Now, the metaphor continues. For instance, Israel is described as the firstborn son of God. Some of the kings, David is described as the son of God. So now the metaphor takes on new meaning. And what they're trying to say by this is we are favored, we are blessed, we are chosen and we are valuable to God. Now, another thing within the context is that the firstborn would also inherit, if not all, more than any of the other children. So he comes to represent the father at quite the early age in their business dealings. It's reminiscent of the scripture in John where they record Jesus saying, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." He's not trying to confuse us by saying he is the Father. This is a function of the firstborn son, is to represent the Father. So that whole history develops as well in their culture. But the concept of the Son of God was not just a Jewish cultural concept that developed over their history. It was a concept that was widely used and understood within the nations surrounding them. So there are a number of stories in which, for instance, Zeus came and fathered some children, and those rulers were known as the sons of Zeus. But only one other person besides Jesus carried this official title of being the Son of God, rather than just the son of one of the gods. And that was Caesar Augustus, the emperor who was in power when Jesus was born. He carried that title as the Son of God. Now, this opens up some very intriguing and significant possibilities of meaning, because when the early believers said Jesus is the Son of God, what they were also saying in effect is Caesar is not. That our loyalty, our devotion is not to our nation. It's not to our patriotism, to our empire, but first and foremost, our devotion is to the message that was embodied in this true Son of God, Jesus. Can you see how understanding some of these ideas within the context in which they develop can greatly enrich the meaning that we see in them? And so this is a thought that I want to leave with you, because I think we'll have to do another 2 or 3 of these sessions and eventually get to the creeds and see how they might be transformed as well. But the idea I want to leave with you is that these truths are meant to convey more meaning than just dogmatic fact. That they are meant to symbolize, for instance, the concept of Jesus being the Son of God. I think what the early believers saw in that is this human, who's a human just like us, is highly favored, has a unique relationship with God, has been chosen, and in some very significant way represents God. And that means we need to give him our attention. The early believers, the earliest ideas around Jesus being the Son of God was not what we have today, where Jesus has always been the Son of God and then he was manifested in the flesh. Rather, it was an idea of he became the Son of God through his obedience. For instance, in Hebrews, that is one of the more ancient Christian ideas, that Jesus, being a human just like us, was honored and welcomed into the divine council as a divine being because of his obedience even unto death. Now later on, when we get to the book of John, that's when the idea of Jesus having always been the Son of God, or this idea of pre-existence, starts making its entrance. But I think even the Gospel of John has something very different in mind than the kind of pre-existence of the Son of God that many believers have today. So we'll explore those ideas in sessions to come. So I just want to leave you with this one idea. In this human Jesus, people came into contact with something that they couldn't describe any other way but divine. It was a message, a peace, a desire that awakened within them a deep appreciation for the value and the meaning of life. Now, that kind of union between God and humanity is something as available and relevant to your life today as it was to Jesus. And as I say, we'll explore that further. But that's it for today. Bless you, friends. Bye.